everybody, and thank you so much for joining me here today. I am Betsy Bird. I blog at a Fuse No. 8 production about children's books, and today I am very, 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 very pleased and honored to be joining James Otis Smith here today. Now, he is the author of the upcoming Black Heroes of the Wild West, which will be released by Toon Books in September of 2020. It is going to be his first book as both author and illustrator, but previously, he adapted Showtime at the Apollo by music writer Ted Fox into a graphic novel that's for adults. He's worked as a production artist for independent movies. He's a childhood fan of old serials and classic American pop culture. And he currently lives in the last apartment free of cats in Brooklyn, New York. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here. And it's an honor to be here with your audience, too.
Go on with you. So, well, some folks might actually already be familiar with your work for adults, like Showtime at the Apollo. But Black Heroes of the Wild West is also a historical book. So it's set in the past as well. Now, was this project originally yours, or were you approached to do it?
Well, it was originally mine, but I grew up as a fan of the Western, a fan of American of classic American pop culture, like from the 50s and older. And I always imagined a Western with, it was obvious to me, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I'm surrounded by Black people. It was obvious to me there was probably Black people then too, but they just weren't in any of the movies. So once I got in touch with Toon Books, we started leaning more towards the educational direction as opposed to making it a fiction. And yeah, I just was really excited about the chance to expand our understanding of American history. And it's really important for us to hear people talk about their lives in their own voices.
Well, and there is so much information here that I didn't know. I knew that there were Black people in the Old West, sure. I didn't know that it was like a third of the people who moved into the Old West. Right. So your book is, and I'm showing right now just a bunch of, a lot, this is I think from the end papers, where you have so much information just packed into this book. In addition to the cartoon stories at the beginning, I don't want people to get the impression that it looks just like this, but you also have comics as well. But it's, I mean, how much research did you do on this?
Well, we read a lot, Francoise and I, but there's actually less than you would imagine about, specifically about the lives of Black people in the Old West. We read books by Trisha Wagner. There's William Katz. There's not a lot, but we read as much as we could. There was also the issue of peeling out the legend from the truth.
Yes.
Because as I said initially, I was initially thinking of just like a piece of fictional entertainment where I would have included a lot more of the legends. But once it became a nonfiction book, then if you take out the legends and the unsubstantiated myths, there's actually not that much.
That's actually something that I really liked about this book. So I'm showing Mary Fields right here.
Mm-hmm.
I have read legitimate kids' books where they're like, and she had a trained bald eagle that she kept on her shoulder and would attack things. Yeah, and I've heard that it's part of her legend, but it is not, in fact, true in any way, shape, or form. And you don't have that in the book. Right. You have all the actual awesome stuff that she did in the book.
Right, yeah. I found one story about the way that she died, and I would have loved to include it, but I couldn't find any evidence that it was actually true.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Well, she was great. And I had sort of heard of her, but only because of this previous kids book that said that she had a trained bald eagle, Your book has one of my favorite moments, and unfortunately we don't have the art from it here, but when she's fighting off a pack of wolves, honestly, right. I didn't realize it was in freezing weather.
Sure.
On top of everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then I'd heard of Bass Reeves to a certain extent because he's had a couple children's books about him. But one guy I have never heard about is Bob Lemmons. How did you hear about Bob Lemmons?
Yeah, that was in the William Katz book, Black Pioneers.
Mm-hmm.
Black Pioneers, but yeah, and one of the reasons that I liked him so much, he's actually the only cowboy in the book. I keep having to tell people, right? I keep having to tell people that there's actually not a lot of cowboys in the book, even though it's the Old West, because the Old West was bigger than just cowboys. But yeah, I loved his story because he got to like people that are not familiar with him. He was the person who figured out how to corral wild horses without doing what they previously did, which was to run them to exhaustion, and then bring them into the corral. So he figured out a way to bring them in, which was essentially to go out and live with them and become a part of the herd, and then become the leader of the herd, and then just bring them into the corral.
It's so smart. And I've never heard of this before. It does mean that you have to do what I've heard so many artists complain about, which is draw horses, which apparently is a very, you do beautiful horses, I have to say.
I appreciate it. It is, I'm mad at horses, and I don't ever want to see one ever again.
Of course, this goes down to the essential children's literature debate. Is it harder to draw horses or bicycles? And I've heard it both ways. I don't.
Yeah, actually, I'll tell you this. I'll pick horses because if you get it right, they look beautiful. Mm-hmm. If you get a bicycle right, it just looks like a bicycle.
That's so true. That is so true. No one is impressed by a bicycle being drawn.
Right, right.
A horse, you got like, look at the muscle, like the musculature here. Like, that's really hard to do.
They are such strange animals.
They are so weird looking. Yes. All right. I'm sorry. I've completely like derailed the entire. Let's talk about horses. Like, okay. Let me bring it back in. So why these three people? Why did you? Were there other people that you were considering that you had to ultimately reject? Why was it Stagecoach Mary, Bass Reeves, and Bob Lemmons?
Well, there's definitely other people. I think you could probably get a whole book out of Nat Love. It'd be great to do a book on Nat Love. But these three, well, let's see. I always knew that I wanted to do, ever since I dreamed of doing a Western, I always knew that I wanted to do something about the great expanse of the desert and just how long it would take to travel and how dangerous it was and how beautiful it is at the same time. So when I came across Bob Lemmons, that's the perfect excuse because he's out there with the horses. He has no one else to talk to. So there's just long expanses of quiet when you're out on the range. And once I realized that I had these three figures who all existed around the same general time period, then I started to do research on the time period. And actually, like, we think a lot about the Civil War and we think a lot about the Jim Crow period that came after, but in between those two periods is Reconstruction, which I never really knew anything about. And when you look at it, when you look at the times, you realize that actually pretty much overlaps perfectly with what we think of as the Old West. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what's interesting is that Reconstruction is when America is when America had a choice as to what kind of country it wanted to become, right? It's just after the Civil War, and Black people still, they're kind of up in the air, right? Like some Black people are elected to public office like immediately after the Civil War. People can travel and choose their own work for the first time ever. And America had a choice what kind of country it wanted to become. And this is the first time that Black people had a choice as to who they wanted to be. So I liked the idea that everyone at the same time is making a choice as to what America is going to look like.
Yeah, and it's funny, I've never actually thought of the Old West in terms of Reconstruction. You're the first person I've heard who sort of put the two ideas together for me in a lot of ways. So
yeah, we learn about history in such a weird way in this country because everything is in a discrete box. But and it just takes one person to point out that these two people, whoever they might be, existed at the same time, and it brings separate events together.
That is so true. Well, and a lot of this is sort of covered too in the intro, which Kadir Nelson actually wrote the intro. Do you know how he got involved with the project to write the intro of the book?
Well, Francoise, the editor, is also the art editor at the New Yorker. So she's been publishing him ever since he was a student. And so there's a little bit of, it's not really nepotism, but and he was extremely gracious. Like, I'm honored to have him in the book, and he really respects comics, and he knows the Wild West as well, the Old West. So yeah, it was. I mean, I couldn't believe he wanted to do it. It's awesome.
Now, I have a real question about how you decided what parts of each of the three lives to include, right? So with Mary Fields, you do like a much wider swath of her life, right? So you don't start when she's a child. You don't go like that far, but you start when she's like, you know, a young adult, and then you go pretty much through her death. Whereas with Bass Reeves, it's a selection from his life. And with Bob Lemmons, it's sort of what he did in his life, but taken with an instance as an example of that. So why did you choose, like, how did you choose with each one? Like, was there ever the thought like, oh, I'll just go through the entire life of Bass Reeves or anything like that?
Well, with Mary Fields, there, if you want to put, almost everything that she did was kind of amazing. Her personality was amazing. So if you want to put anything about her in context, then you kind of just need her whole life. There really is no one bit to pick out that's more incredible than the next. With Bass Reeves, you know, ultimately he is a cop, and cops' stories are kind of episodic, right? You chase a bad guy, you catch the bad guy, you chase another one, you catch another one. So, you know, I thought it would be interesting to just take one, particularly one where he doesn't actually have to use his gun. Because the other love that I have, aside from Westerns, is I love stories about con artists. So the idea that he cons the bad guys.
Yeah, he does.
Is great. And then with Bob Lemmons, I liked the idea once we got to that part of the book where essentially the book is expanding as you read it. The first part is much more densely packed because it's an entire life. And then it opens out a little bit and you get this one anecdote, and then it opens out much more. And then you essentially just have pages of this guy traveling. So the book is kind of like Western expansion in the sense that it is expanding outward as you read it.
Huh. That's a nice way of doing it. Now, you mentioned you liked the West. Like, what's your personal history with the Wild West in any form?
I mean, well, I grew up in the 80s, and a lot of your viewers, I guess, were not familiar with the 80s, but
don't scare me. Stop scaring me.
But we had a lot of old stuff on television, right?
Yeah, we did.
Really old stuff. And so you got to love, right, Star Wars and The Lone Ranger at the same time.
Yeah.
Right? And so for me, and this is kind of what the book is about, all of that was always just American culture, right? It was never, this is for certain kinds of people, this is for certain ages of people. It was just always all there. I also just love the look. I love the look of the cowboy, right? And if you've been out to the desert, I don't know if you've ever been in the desert, but you have no idea how many different kinds of rocks there are. And just every 15 minutes when the light changes, everything changes color. It's incredible. It's beautiful. So all of that, like, I've just always loved all of that, along with, you know, the science fiction and action and all the rest of it. Like, it's always worked in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Of course, you're in Brooklyn, where I guess when the night changes, things change, but in a very different way. Yeah.
Yes.
Different things turn on more. So with the current protests that are going on, and there's a lot of black cowboys and urban riders appearing on their horses at the protests. I know that there's a movie version of Greg Nary's book Ghetto Cowboy, which the movie is called Concrete Cowboys. It's coming out with Idris Elba and Method Man. That's going to be later this year. Do you feel like your book's coming out at pretty much the exact right time, or is there no wrong time?
There's also a Bass movie, a Bass Reeves.
Is it really?
Coming out too, yeah.
I didn't know that. Oh, you are the great time. Huh.
Yeah, actually, it's funny. We started talking about this book in late 2018. And 6 months later, the biggest song in the country was Old Town Road.
Old Town Road.
Hip-hop country song, right? Someone in the fashion industry also started a cowboy trend, which is
really
still ongoing, like the boots and the buckles. Like, it's always been there, but it's kind of like the movies. The Westerns come into fashion, they go out of fashion. In music, it's actually always been there. Like, Beyonce has a country song on Lemonade, right? Like, it's never gone away. I think why it does sometimes, particularly in the narrative entertainment, like movies and TV, why it goes away, I think it is because we focus on such a narrow range of people. Then once you exhaust that, people get bored. But there were so many people, right? Like, yes, a third of the cowboys were black, a third were Mexican. We never see Mexican cowboys, right? So
not in America.
Right.
Yeah.
So the story or the possibility of stories is so much wider. And I think what's going on right now is essentially people saying the stories that we can tell about who and what America is much wider than we are being told. And that's why the statues are coming down. It's because those aren't the only people, right? And so this is just another example of, like, yeah, the people that we know, those aren't the only people. America's much bigger than we think it is.
That's excellent. Well, I've got you for maybe about 2 more minutes here. What are you working on next, or can you say?
Well, the very next thing I'm working on is a book with Boom, which I can't really talk about, but that's another nonfiction book about a musician. And then Francoise and I are talking about doing some more Black Heroes of the Wild West, or maybe moving around the timeline a little bit, but in the same general area. And I can't talk about that at all. And just because I mentioned Nat Love doesn't mean it's going to be Nat Love, but it could be.
The door is open to Nat Love any old time he wants to wander in. There you go. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much for just chatting with me today about your book. It is fantastic. Yeah. I would hold it up right now, but another one of my librarians stole it from me to read. So, because everybody wants to read it right now.
Well, you can always buy more.
That's exactly true. And as I should say, folks, it's going to come out in September of 2020. So people can get their pre-orders in right now. And that's coming from Toon Books. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for joining me. Bye.